welcome to everybody in person and online to tonight's event from the Eckhart Center at Albertus Magnus College, Job, Suffering, and the Problem of Evil, according to Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great, with Dr. Franklin Harkins. As many of you know, this year Albertus Magnus College is celebrating its centennial year. 100 years ago, the Dominican Sisters of Peace founded the college to extend educational opportunity to women. And when we meet with students for their orientation, we tell them that the sisters chose to name the college after Albert the Great several years before his official canonization, because he embodied what we hope for our students and ourselves: curiosity in many things, a deep engagement both with tradition and the needs of the world, and a commitment to living out that Dominican motto, to contemplate and share the fruits of our contemplation. We found it fitting that we might learn more about our namesake during our centennial year. Tonight, our guest will explore how Albert and his great student, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose feast day we celebrate today, approached the book of Job and its exploration of one of the most difficult problems in theology. How can we understand the experience of evil in light of our faith in an all-good God? In my theology courses, this is often the question that animates my students more than any other. So tonight, our guest will draw us into conversation on this question with the medieval Dominican greats. I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Franklin T. Harkins. He is the Professor of Historical Theology and Professor Ordinarius at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. A native of North Carolina, he studied psychology and biology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, received a Master of Divinity at Duke Divinity School, and completed a PhD in medieval theology at the University of Notre Dame. He also holds a licentiate from the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. Before joining the faculty at Boston College, he served as a postdoctoral fellow at Valparaiso University and held faculty positions at Fordham University and Durham University. Dr. Harkins has served as president of the International Albertus Magnus Society. So what better guest to teach us about Albertus Magnus than the former president of the society, right? And served as the president of the Society for the Study of the Bible in the Middle Ages. He is co-editor of the Fordham series in medieval studies and serves on the editorial board of Victorian Texts in Translation. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished scholar of Albertus Magnus to Albertus Magnus College.
Thank you so much, Edward. Thank you for your kind invitation to Albertus Magnus as well. It's really wonderful. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here. This is my first time at Albertus Magnus, and I have really been overwhelmed today with your hospitality and generosity and wonderful welcome. So thank you. Thank you all. And thank you for coming this evening. You should have a handout. It is one page, two-sided. One side is a very brief timeline of the life and works of Albert, and the other side, which I will mention momentarily, gives you an example of the handwriting of Albert's most famous student, St. Thomas Aquinas, and gives us evidence that Thomas was in the lecture room when Albert was lecturing on a number of Dionysian texts, but more on that in a moment. Many modern readers of Job begin with two significant assumptions about the biblical book. First, they assume that Job is concerned fundamentally with the so-called problem of evil. This presupposition is conspicuously captured, for instance, in the title of Joseph Kelly's wide-ranging book on the subject, The Problem of Evil in the Western Tradition, from the book of Job to modern genetics. Similarly, Richard Swinburne opens the first chapter of his Providence and the Problem of Evil with Job's words of complaint to God in chapter 10. My soul is weary of my life. I will give free course to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Eleanor Stump takes this modern presupposition a step further, maintaining that, quote, the book of Job is the paradigmatic presentation of the problem of evil for anyone trying to reconcile the existence of God with the presence of evil in the world, end quote. As Stump suggests, the problem of evil, as generally conceived by contemporary philosophers, is a problem for divine existence. More specifically, it holds that the reality of evil in the world is incompatible with, or at least counts as evidence against, the existence of the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God of traditional theism, particularly if no morally sufficient reason can be found for this God to allow evil and suffering. The second assumption. Many modern readers of Job make a twofold assumption that seems to follow naturally from the first. Namely, they imagine not only that Job and his interlocutors were grappling with the problem of evil among themselves, but also that all interpreters of the book of Job down through the centuries simply took for granted that this problem constitutes the book's central theme. The philosopher Errol E. Harris exemplifies this tendency when he writes, quote, since biblical times, the experience of evil has presented theists and theologians with what seems an insuperable obstacle to belief in the existence of a benevolent and all-powerful God. Unmerited misfortune and suffering have always seemed irreconcilable with an omnipotent creator of supreme justice and mercy. With this mystery, Job and his admonitors wrestled. End quote. In my lecture this evening, I aim to offer a twofold test case of sorts of Harris's thesis by considering in very broad brushstrokes how Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus understood and interpreted the book of Job. As Catholic thinkers belonging to the Dominican order, both were theists, of course, of the High Middle Ages, and both were careful and astute readers of the book of Job. Did Aquinas and Albert understand the evil that befell Job as an insuperable obstacle to belief in divine existence? Did they take Job's misfortune and suffering as irreconcilable with an omnipotent creator? In short, did our two medieval Dominicans understand Job as a biblical book about the problem of evil? The short answer is no, of course not. Their profound and profoundly theological readings provide clear testimony that, as Mark Larimore has pointed out, the book of Job resists being corralled into a single interpretation. The interpretations of Aquinas and Albert also remind us that the problem of evil is a particularly modern philosophical conundrum. It bears virtually no resemblance to pre-modern approaches to Job, whether Christian or Jewish. Indeed, this problem, which seems both obvious and intractable to so many people today, is, in the words of Karen Kilby, quote, a distinctive product of the Enlightenment, rather than a natural continuation of any kind of theological tradition, end quote. This evening's lecture is divided into two distinct parts. In the first, I will offer a brief introduction to the life and works of Albert the Great. From here, we will move to the second, larger part, which will consider how Thomas Aquinas and his learned teacher, Albertus Magnus, interpreted the book of Job and understood evil vis-a-vis God in light of it. So, part one, the life and works of Albert. A very brief overview. In our attempt to capture something of Albert the person, we must note at the outset that Albert lived, as Leslie Smith observes in her recent biography of William of Auvergne, in an age when individuals are hard to find. We simply do not know much about his personality and his personal preferences beyond what can be gleaned from his writings and thought. But we do know most obviously that Albert was and is great. The only Christian thinker of the high Middle Ages to be given the moniker Magnus, great, and this during his own lifetime. He was great in learning, in philosophy and the natural sciences, as well as in theology and what today we call biblical studies. And he was great in teaching as a master of theology. Indeed, one of his students, Ulrich of Strasbourg, who died in 1277, described Albert as, quote, so godlike in every branch of knowledge that he can properly be called the wonder and marvel of our age, end quote. Similarly, the 14th century Dominican chronicler Henry of Hereford wrote that just as God established the sun and the moon as two great lights to illuminate the world, so too Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great were the two great lights of the Dominican order. Although today Aquinas is the more well-known medieval theologian and philosopher, in the high and late Middle Ages it was Albert who was actually more renowned for his learning and teaching. Such renown is suggested by the epitaph at Albert's tomb in the church of St. Andreas in Cologne. The epitaph dates to the 15th century and describes Albert as, quote, chief among philosophers, greater than Plato, and hardly inferior to King Solomon in wisdom, end quote. That's high praise. Albert also wrote more and on a wider range of philosophical, scientific, and theological themes than did his famous student, Thomas Aquinas. Indeed. Irvin Resnick has described Albert as the most prolific author of the whole of the Middle Ages, noting that his various works run to more than 20,000 manuscript pages. Albert appears to have been born around 1200 in Lauingen, a small town in the southern region of Germany known as Swabia, to a knightly family. He studied the arts at Padua as a young man and likely joined the Dominican order there in 1223. Around 1230, the order sent Albert to Cologne to study theology. Here he became a lector and provided basic theological instruction to the Dominican community. Throughout the next decade, Albert traveled throughout Germany, serving as theological lector at various Dominican priories. Around 1240, Albert was sent to Paris, where he lectured on Peter Lombard's sentences under Master Garrick of St. Quentin. After receiving the official license to teach, Albert himself served from 1245 to 48 as regent master at Paris in the Dominican chair for externs or foreigners. The young Thomas Aquinas arrived at Paris in the fall of 1245 and began his theological studies under Master Albert, who lectured on the Dionysian corpus in Paris and later in Cologne. That Aquinas attended these lectures is attested by a well-known manuscript now in Naples, a manuscript that apparently Aquinas kept with him throughout his life. This manuscript contains a copy of Albert's lectures on 4 works of Dionysius, on the celestial hierarchy, on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, on mystical theology, and, on your handout, written in Aquinas' own illegible hand on the divine names. Because we need to move on to the topic for tonight's lecture, Job and the Problem of Evil, allow me to simply gesture at a few highlights from the rest of Albert's life and works. And you have more detail there on the handout. In the summer of 1248, Albert, together with Thomas Aquinas and several other Dominicans, departed Paris for Cologne, where he established the order's first Studium Generale in Germany and served as regent master there from 1248 to 54. Over the next 2 decades or so, Albert would produce paraphrases of and commentaries on the entire Aristotelian corpus, write commentaries on the scriptural books of Isaiah, Job, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Serve as Dominican Provincial of Germany from 54 to 57. Serve as Bishop of Regensburg from 1260 to 62, and preached the crusade in German-speaking lands. And produced several theological works, including his own Summa of Theology and On the Sacrifice of the Mass. After a long and productive life in service to the Dominican order and to the church, Albert died on November 15th, 1280. As indicated on your handout, he was canonized and declared a doctor of the church in 1931 and named the patron saint of students of the natural sciences in 1941. Part 2. Aquinas and Albert on Job and the problem of evil. Here, this second part, like many medieval summae, is divided into 3 sections. Contextualization and orientation, first. Section B, Aquinas on the whirlwind in Job chapter 38, and the limited knowability of God. And thirdly, evil, the existence of God, and providence. So, section A. It is historically noteworthy that Aquinas, the renowned student of Albertus Magnus, actually produced his Job commentary before Master Albert penned his. Furthermore, Albert seems to have taken what he understands as the organizing principle of the book of Job from his famous student, namely that the biblical book recounts an academic disputation among Job and his friends on the topic of divine providence. Aquinas produced his exposition on Job according to the letter while serving as conventual lector at the Priory of San Domenico in Orvieto during the period 1261 to 64. Of all the sacred books that Aquinas might have selected as the basis for his cursory lectures to his Dominican confreres in Orvieto, he chose Job. Furthermore, whereas the majority of Aquinas' lectures on scriptural books have come down to us in the form of student notes, known as reportationes in Latin, his commentary on Job carries the title Expositio, indicating that Thomas himself revised and prepared the work for publication. This intimates Aquinas' special regard for the book of Job and his comments on it. In the prologue to his exposition on Job, Aquinas indicates the problem in response to which the book of Job was written. It is an unmistakably human problem, not a problem for God. The problem is primarily epistemological and theological, but with significant cultic and moral implications. Namely, that humans may not naturally or easily apprehend the extent of divine providence vis-a-vis human affairs. It turns out, Aquinas explains, that from the beginning many humans have erred on account of imperfect knowledge concerning the truth of divine providence. Some have swept away divine providence altogether, attributing everything to fortune and chance. Others have understood that nature, because of its apparent order, is governed by providence, but have doubted whether human affairs, which manifest no certain order, are sustained and guided by divine care. With apparent sympathy for this latter position, Aquinas observes, quote, "For good things do not always happen to good people, or bad things to bad people. Neither, on the other hand, do bad things always happen to good people, nor good things to bad people. Rather, good and bad things happen indifferently to good and bad people." For Aquinas, this basic epistemological problem that we humans may not naturally know that God's providence extends to human affairs has grave cultic and ethical implications. Namely, no fear and love of God in connection with truth will remain among humans, who will be indolent concerning the virtues and greatly inclined toward vice. It is precisely as an antidote to these ills, according to Aquinas, that God has revealed himself to and through Job. particularly the human writers of scriptural texts, such as Job, had as their first and most important task to remove from human hearts the opinion that human affairs are not governed by God. For Aquinas, the whole intention of the book of Job is, quote, to show by means of probable arguments that human affairs are directed by divine providence, end quote. But because the suffering of the just appears to undermine the very foundation of providence, this sacred book proposes as the topic of the question under discussion the manifold and severe sufferings of a certain man, perfect in every virtue, who is called Job. For Aquinas, then, Job's suffering provides an extreme case study, as it were, by means of which Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar debate in the manner of a medieval scholastic disputation the crucial question of the divine governance of human affairs. In short, Aquinas' exposition is, as Father Jean-Pierre Tourelle has noted, a profound meditation on the human condition, particularly on the fact that the suffering of the just may inspire doubts about the existence of divine justice. But significantly, on Aquinas' reading, such suffering never inspires doubts about the existence of God. The same is true of Albert as well. Albert the Great produced his commentary on Job, entitled simply Super Job in Latin, when he was over 70 years old in Cologne at the Dominican convent of the Holy Cross, where he appears to have resided as lector emeritus of the order from 1269 until his death in 1280. According to the manuscripts, On Job was completed in either 1272 or 1274. And it appears that Albert's commentary, like Aquinas', grew out of lectures he gave to his Dominican confreres. As mentioned earlier, Albert's basic assumption concerning the fundamental nature of the book of Job, that it is an academic disputation among Job and his friends concerning divine providence, appears to have been taken from Aquinas' exposition and developed more fully in the Super Job of Albert. Indeed, as Ruth Meyer has noted, Albert is unique in the history of Joban commentators in that he understands the entire biblical book as a disputation. Albert sketches the contours of the disputation at the outset of his comments on chapter 3, where Job first opens his mouth and speaks to the friends who sat with him in silent solidarity for a week following his unimaginable suffering. Chapters 2 and 3. Here, Albert describes the book of Job as containing, quote, a complete disputation among 5 people, namely Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu, concerning the all-encompassing providence or care by which the Creator rules and governs human affairs, end quote. All of the disputants agree on 3 fundamental points, Albert proceeds to explain. 1, that God, who is the creator and governor, possesses perfect knowledge of all human affairs. 2, that there is absolutely no unfairness or sin, iniquitas vel peccatum is his Latin, in God's governing. And 3, that God considers human affairs more intimately than does the human who performs them, and therefore God sometimes grasps a defect in those actions that escapes the notice of the human, him or herself. Beyond these basic points of correspondence, the views of the interlocutors variously diverge. Eliphaz endorses a straightforward act-consequence model, maintaining that God governs human affairs according to merits, repaying good people with good things and bad people with bad things, though he acknowledges that human sinfulness and demerit sometimes remain hidden from humans themselves. Bildad, in contrast, denies that divine providence rules human affairs according to merits. Rather, God always governs with an eye to what is best in relation to the end of human happiness. On Albert's reading of Bildad's line of argument, if God sometimes brings forth bad things for good people, he compensates for this by giving them many good things in the end. Howard himself seems to have some sympathy for this teleological perspective, which he received from Moses Maimonides. Job's third friend, Zophar, holds that God governs human affairs according to his divine will alone, the cause of which cannot be known and therefore should not be sought by humans. For Albert, Zophar's rhetorical questions in chapter 11, verses 7 and 8 epitomize his position. Will you by chance comprehend the steps of God, and will you get to know the Almighty perfectly? He is higher than heaven, so what will you do? Like Zophar, Elihu, who enters the debate only in chapter 32, maintains that no human can completely understand the operations of divine providence. Elihu adds, though, that God sometimes grants to particular humans through dreams or angelic mediation a degree of insight into his will. Even if it is assumed that the inner workings of God's providential will are ordinarily inaccessible to the human mind, all of Job's friends generally assume that divine providence and justice must somehow operate according to human justice. Job, too, held this view at first, as is manifest according to Albert when he declares in chapter 13, "If I will be judged, I will be found just." And in chapter 6, "If only my sins for which I deserved wrath and the calamity that I suffer were weighed on the scales." With such words, Job maintains his righteousness, Albert teaches, because, quote, "it seemed to Job that God ought to have governed as if the justice of human governance were the exemplar of the order of divine justice," end quote. But both Job and his friends required divine correction on this point. Indeed, Albert declares that God alone is able to determine the disputation, and he does so out of the whirlwind, de turbine in Latin, chapter 38, verse 1, which phrase, out of the whirlwind, Albert takes as a reference to the clash or conflict of the disputation itself. In his magisterial determination of the disputed question, God reveals, contra the initial position of Job and the position of each of his friends, that he rules human life without consideration of human merits. But when the Lord finally settles the disputation, Albert explains, Job realizes that the order of divine justice is utterly different from the order of human justice. For the human person who is created from mud is not so dignified that God should be obliged by the order of human justice. In short, the mysterious operations of divine providence, which infinitely surpass human understanding, are not and cannot be constrained by the expectations of human providence. Section B, Aquinas on the whirlwind and the limited knowability of God. For Aquinas, the whirlwind out of which God speaks at the end of Job points not, as Albert understands it, to the conflict of the disputation itself. Rather, Aquinas reads the phrase de turbine metaphorically, as signifying the interior inspiration divinely committed to Job himself. The sacred text speaks metaphorically of God responding to Job out of the whirlwind, not only to indicate the disturbance that Job continued to suffer at that time, Aquinas explains, but also, quote, "on account of the obscurity of the whirlwind." That is, because in this life we cannot perceive divine inspiration clearly, but with a certain overshadowing of sensible similitudes, end quote. By virtue of its obscurity, the physical whirlwind serves as a metaphor for the inability of humans to receive divine revelation directly and to understand it plainly. This human epistemological limitation vis-a-vis divine revelation is precisely what God reveals to Job, to and through Job, on Aquinas' reading. This interpretation of de turbine returns us to the prologue of the exposition and recapitulates Aquinas' teaching concerning the purpose of the book of Job, namely to make clear to us humans who may have little or no natural knowledge of this truth that divine providence does, in fact, extend to human affairs. Aquinas and Albert agree that God himself had to enter the disputation precisely because this question of where and how God is to be found among human affairs often proves too challenging for us. But because human wisdom is not sufficient to comprehend the truth of divine providence, Aquinas explains, it was necessary that the preceding debate be determined by divine authority. It is important to note that although God's self-revelation in Job 38 through 41 shows that God governs human affairs, it does not indicate precisely how divine providence operates. Even here, God appears out of the whirlwind after all. Aquinas, like Albert, takes very seriously the limits on our ability to know God. Both of our Dominicans understand that when theologians talk about God, they quite literally do not know what they are talking about. They take the view that in this life, we humans simply do not and cannot have any positive idea of what God is, much less how precisely God governs human affairs. Of Aquinas, on precisely this point, the great 20th century Dominican philosopher Herbert McCabe says this, quote, "He was, Aquinas, was, I suppose, the most agnostic theologian in the Western Christian tradition. Not agnostic in the sense of doubting whether God exists, but agnostic in the sense of being quite clear and certain that God is a mystery beyond any understanding we can now have." End quote. For Aquinas and Albert, we can naturally know only what God is not by causal inference from his created effects, that is, only by way of remotion or privative understanding. We can know, for instance, that God is not corporeal, temporal, or finite. Even when we are able to have what Albert calls a positive understanding of God, knowing, for example, that he is an incorporeal substance, we cannot define the divine substance in terms of genus, species, difference, and number because it is infinitely immanent beyond every substance. The traditional doctrine of divine simplicity exemplifies the apophaticism of Aquinas and Albert. Whereas we know certain created things by knowing the various ways in which they are composed, according to body and soul, matter and form, essence and existence, for example, God cannot be known in any of these ways because God is wholly incomposite. Rather, God is entirely simple, omnino simplex, or truly simple, undetermined by any parts or by any mode of composition. Albert teaches that divine simplicity is of an entirely different order from the modes of simplicity that various created things, such as the simplicity of unity of a point, of quantity, of a homogeneous body, and of the principles of a substance. To the objection that some thinkers who note that Scripture calls God a rock and a place and sometimes water and things of this sort, which are homogeneous bodies, Albert responds, quote, "But this is nonsense, because such things are said of God symbolically," end quote, describing him by the dissimilar likeness of analogies, rather than by the nature of the simple essence in God. Those are Albert's words. In short, for both Albert and Aquinas, God is not a being of this or that kind, with this body and that soul, this matter and that form, this essence and that existence. Rather, unlike every created being, God's essence is God's existence. Indeed, what it means to be God is to be existence itself. That is, to be, essay. So God is not a composite being, rather God is simply to be. Aquinas and Albert then understand the word deus, God, as a verb more than a noun. God is pure act, subsisting to be itself. As pure actuality and subsisting to be, God cannot fail to be. This is true, according to Albert and Aquinas, apart from any consideration of creation and evil of any kind, including human suffering. Already in our brief consideration of Aquinas and Albert on Job, we have come a long way from the modern philosophical problem of evil and its assumptions concerning God's existence and operations. But let us continue further still. Evil, the existence of God, and providence. The problem of evil, as formulated by modern thinkers, is a particular post-Enlightenment philosophical conundrum, whereas modern readers of Job often understand the book as we've seen in Eleanor Stump's words, the paradigmatic presentation of the problem of evil. No ancient or medieval Christian writer of whom I am aware read Job as treating the question of whether or how evil can be reconciled with God's existence. Although Aquinas' exposition on Job can be read as speaking to certain aspects of what moderns call the problem of evil, several scholars have noted that Aquinas himself is not here concerned with this problem. Brian Davis extends this claim to the entire Thomistic corpus. He says, quote, Aquinas has nothing to say on the topic. He never offers a standalone discussion of what contemporary philosophers have come to call the problem of evil. He has no book or essay on it. He offers no full-length treatment, starting along the lines, God is X, Y, and Z, etc., yet evil exists. So how can we reconcile evil with God's existence? In this sense, what now passes as the problem of evil goes unmentioned in Aquinas' writings, end quote. Though Aquinas nowhere provides a full-length treatment of the contemporary problem of evil, it is true, he is certainly aware of the basic line of argument, which he proposes as an objection to divine existence in the Summa, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3. If God, whose name signifies a certain infinite goodness, existed, then no evil would be found in the world. Since if one of two contraries is infinite, the other would be completely destroyed, the objection says. Aquinas responds by maintaining that it pertains to God's infinite goodness to allow evil and to draw good out of it. As we have seen, the fundamental problem that evil raises for Aquinas and Albert is not that of God's existence, but rather that of God's providence concerning human affairs. The existence of evil in the world never suggests to either theologian, as far as I'm aware, that God may not exist. In fact, just the opposite is true. Both Aquinas and Albert take the reality of evil as evidence for divine existence. In Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 71, for instance, Aquinas counters those who deny the existence of God on account of the evil they observe in the world by maintaining that the reality of evil is not incompatible with either divine existence or divine providence. Remarking that Boethius in Book 1 of Consolation of Philosophy introduces a certain philosopher who asks, if God exists, whence comes evil? Aquinas observes, quote, on the contrary, however, he ought to have argued, if evil exists, God exists. For evil would not exist if the order of good were removed, the privation of which is evil. But this order would not exist if God did not exist, end quote. Significantly, Aquinas here turns the standard problem of evil argument on its head. The reality of evil in the world presupposes a good order, which in turn presupposes God. Whereas evil in the world never causes Aquinas and Albert to question divine existence, it does lead them to wonder how precisely God's providence operates. It seems that all things are not subject to divine providence, Aquinas notes, because a wise and omnipotent provider like God would, it appears, exclude all evil and defect from those creatures in his care. Aquinas responds by distinguishing between God as the universal provider on the one hand and any particular provider on the other. Whereas a particular provider excludes defects from what she cares for as far as she can, think, for example, of a tomato farmer produce healthy and delicious fruit. Yes, tomatoes are fruit. The universal provider, namely God, who takes care of all being, permits certain defects in some things, lest the perfect good of the universe be hindered. Those are Aquinas' words. For Aquinas, the good of the whole necessitates that there be inequality among things, some incorruptible and others corruptible, for example, so that every grade of being and every grade of goodness might be realized. Thus, the perfect order of the universe requires, this is Aquinas' word, requirit in Latin, creatures that can be and sometimes are corrupted. Aquinas explains, quote, if every evil were prevented, many good things would be absent from the universe. For no lion would live if there were no killing of animals. And there would be no patience of martyrs if there were no persecution by tyrants. End quote. Similarly, Albert teaches that evils, though not directly caused by God, are certainly subject to divine providence. This is so, according to Albert, because all evils, whether natural or moral in nature, are orderable. Ordinabilia is the Latin. And indeed ordered to a particular end. And providence signifies, quote, the form of the order of all things to be conducted toward becoming, toward existence, toward conservation, and toward the things through which something is led to its proper end, end quote. Furthermore, because Albert understands God as altogether simple, he identifies God's providence with God himself. Quote, it must be said that God is the highest good, and God is his providence, and so the highest good is providence. End quote. Thus, precisely in their being orderable, evils point to God's providence, which is God, the highest good. Just as for Aquinas, then, so too for Albert, evil serves as evidence for the good order of things, and therefore for the existence of God, who governs all things providentially. But because God's providential governing of human affairs may not always be obvious to us, both Aquinas and Albert understand this profound theological truth to have been revealed to and through Job. Conclusion. Having surveyed some of the interpretive insights of Aquinas and Albert the Great on Job, let us return finally to those aforementioned claims of Errol Harris that since biblical times the experience of evil has presented theists and theologians with what seems an insuperable obstacle to belief in the existence of a benevolent and all-powerful God, and unmerited misfortune and suffering have always seemed irreconcilable with an omnipotent creator of supreme justice and mercy. We can now say that this, as a universal transhistorical philosophical claim, is simply incorrect. Although evil may indeed present many modern people with an insuperable obstacle to belief in the existence of God, nowhere do either Job and his interlocutors or Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great as commentators on Job suggest that suffering is irreconcilable with an omnipotent and providential creator. Whereas Harris himself, perhaps like other modern philosophers, may have wrestled with the mystery of divine existence in the face of evil, the problem that stands at the heart of the problem of evil today was not the problem of either Job and his friends or Aquinas and Albert. The modern myopic view that the existence of evil represents a genuine threat to the existence of God should not be anachronistically retrojected into the past, blinding us to alternative perspectives on evil, God, and divine providence. We have aimed to make clear just how differently Aquinas and Albert approach the reality of evil and suffering than do certain modern problem of evil philosophers. The perspective of our medieval Dominicans is not that of common theism, which treats both God and evil abstractly detached from any particular religious narrative or theological context. Rather, as Catholic theologians, Aquinas and Albert understand evil from within a theological tradition at the heart of which stands redemption through the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ. With salvation through Christ as the paradigmatic example, Aquinas and Albert believe that all natural evil, including human suffering, comes ultimately from God and is ordered toward the good. The final good toward which the suffering of the saints, such as Job, is ordered is eternal life. On the reading of our Dominicans, Job's words in chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and on the last day I will rise from the earth," etc., bespeak his hope in salvation through Christ, bodily resurrection, and beatific vision. This interpretation of Job 19, 25 through 27 illustrates the diametrical opposition, in fact, between the perspectives of our medieval Dominican theologians and that of modern problem of evil philosophers, such as J.L. Mackie and William Rowe. In 1979, William Rowe took evil as evidence for the non-existence of God. Indeed, in his words, as a straightforward argument for atheism. Some 7 centuries earlier, Aquinas was aware of thinkers who, like Rowe, denied divine existence on account of the evil they observed in the world. Whereas, for example, the philosopher mentioned by Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy asks, if God exists, whence comes evil? Aquinas claims that he ought to have argued the opposite. If evil exists, God exists. Strikingly, Aquinas turns the basic problem of evil upside down. Evil presupposes and is parasitic on a good order among creatures, and this good order presupposes a good God who creates and governs providentially. Albert too recognizes that evil presupposes God precisely because all evils are orderable to an end, the form of which order is God's providence, which in turn is, by virtue of divine simplicity, God, the highest good. Aquinas and Albert take God to be the answer to the question, why is there anything rather than nothing? The biblical account of Job is about many things rather than no things. It is about Job, his wife, his children, his servants, his sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, etc. It narrates Job's righteousness and prosperity, followed by the theft and destruction of his livestock, the slaughter of his servants, the death of his children, and his great suffering that followed from these losses. For Aquinas and Albert, all of these created things and all of the evils that befell them can ultimately be accounted for only by having recourse to God. As controversial as it may sound to modern ears, then, our medieval Dominicans understand evil as constituting compelling evidence that a good and providential God does, in fact, exist. And because some people may have difficulty arriving at this truth naturally, God himself has revealed it, according to Aquinas and Albert, in and through the book of Job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Harkins. We covered a lot of dynamic ground in that wonderful lecture. We learned something of the standing and the creativity of Albert the Great in his day. We heard about the interpretation of Job as a disputation. We speak of disputatio at this college quite a bit in terms of our connection to the Dominican tradition. And we learned of Albert and Aquinas' interpretation of evil as ordered toward good, perhaps ordered toward God. So I'd like to invite you to do, those of you in the room, you're nicely positioned next to interlocutors. For the next 2 minutes, turn to somebody next to you and share something that stood out to you, or perhaps a question you had that you'd like to raise to the group. And if you're online, you can feel free to raise insights in the chat box. Let's do that for 2 minutes and then reconvene for a conversation with Dr. Harkins. this wonderful buzz of conversation in the room. And I sense a buzz of good thinking online as well. We'll now reconvene. And I'm going to take the privilege of posing the first question as perhaps those among us collect their thoughts and think about what they'd like to raise. Earlier today, you joined us for a lunch discussion about Albert and Aquinas, and one comment that you made that I found interesting was that Albert saw theology as a practical discipline. That there are practical takeaways for one's relationship with God and the neighbor that should come from theology. Can you speak a little bit about how you think Albert would have seen theologizing about the problem of evil as practical? What would he have invited us to do, perhaps, in response to these realizations?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great question. Yes, Albert, this is one point on which Albert and Thomas Aquinas disagreed, actually, about the fundamental nature of theology. Is it practical or is it speculative? Aquinas thought it was speculative. Albert said, no, it's practical. And he said that because it's a science according to, he uses this phrase quite frequently, theology is a science according to piety. Meaning the point is, right, not to just learn as much as possible about God and creation and so forth, although Albert was obviously very keen to learn as much as possible, but not learning for the sake of learning, right, but learning for the sake of piety, devotion to God, love of neighbor, which is also very Augustinian, of course. So I think in this case, right, on the one hand, Albert and Aquinas, I don't want you to be left after this lecture with the wrong impression. Albert and Aquinas certainly understood evil as evil. It's bad. Whether it's natural evil or moral evil, it's bad. And so there are things that we as people of faith can and should do. For example, to help the neighbor in the midst of some natural disaster, let's say. Maybe in the midst of some moral disaster as well. But anyway, so that would be an emphasis in Albert, right? That the theologian's eye should always be on the actual. I suppose he might like the phrase, the actual doing or acting out of theological truths, right? So practical. We have a sub-discipline, right, of practical theology nowadays. The emphasis or the telos, if you will, for Albert would certainly be on action, practice. So, but together with, of course, a certain degree, albeit limited, of understanding God, the extension of God's providence to human affairs, and so forth and so on, as I've tried to indicate here. So.
Thank you. We have several questions in the room and online, so we'll go back and forth. If you're in the room, please speak into the mic here that I give you so that those online can hear you. And we have a question from Dr. Sozak.
Dr. Harkins, thank you very much for the talk. Two quick questions. One about kind of popular space and one more exegetical. The discussion of the problem of evil reminds me of the New Atheism movement now 20 years ago. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. I believe Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great. In both of those books, as we know, a lot of arguments from the Enlightened period were rehashed, and I think the problem of evil was very prominent in both, exactly as a reason not to believe in God. Bishop Robert Barron, in his response to these so-called new atheists, has often referred to Thomas Aquinas' view of God as to be, right? So God is being itself, not a being.
because you have to know what people are saying, right? As a theologian, as a student of historical theology. And I've read enough to know, as you suggest, that neither of them really has any understanding of traditional Christian notions, or lack thereof, of God. They seem to reduce God to a very large, albeit invisible creature, right? Which is one problem, I think, with our post-Enlightenment conceptions of God in general. But I once attended actually a debate between Christopher Hitchens and a theologian, and it became very clear to me that Hitchens really, like he wasn't drawing on any way of understanding God that was familiar to me from reading Albert and Thomas Aquinas and others. So that's a problem, right? Like I don't go to a debate on nuclear physics without knowing anything about it. So no, I think just correcting. Actually, Brian Davies, who's a great scholar of Aquinas in particular, philosopher at Fordham, I think he has said that one of Aquinas' major contributions, along with his understanding of the compatibility between faith and reason, which we hear about a lot, which is a great and wonderful thing. He probably learned that from Albert, of course, but anyway, the other major contribution is that actually both of them, Aquinas and Albert, can help us to correct our inappropriate and insufficient ways of understanding God. Now, obviously, as we've suggested here, they knew that even one who approaches the understanding of God in all the right ways will be limited in that understanding, right? But there are some good and profitable ways, I think, and I think that our medieval Dominicans certainly thought that, and there are some not so healthy or profitable ways. So I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a solution to that, but I do think Albert and Aquinas can be used, as you suggest, as resources precisely on this point. Now, whether the new atheists understand anything that might be said using the great Dominican theologians, that's another question. But we can try at least.
We now have a question from online.
All right, so we got a question here that says, from Mike Bodner. Thank you for a great presentation. Can you comment on how human free will interacts with God's governance of human affairs?
Oh yes, thank you. That's a wonderful question. Well, for example, if you look at Aquinas' lengthy and in-depth treatment of divine providence in Summa Contra Gentiles, the lesser-known Summa, Book 3, he makes quite clear that God's providence operates through various secondary causes, one of which is human free will, or free choice, right? And so today, maybe this is another mistaken idea that modern folk might tend to have. Today we tend to think, well, it's only if there is no divine causality, right, of what I do and how I think and how I live, that I am completely free as a human being. And Aquinas thinks just the opposite. No, you are free because God has created you to be free, and God actually causes, in every instance of your free willing and doing, God actually causes your free willing and doing. So again, God is not, see, the mistake is imagining that God is a creature, right? So So if I, a creature, am causing you to do something, you're not freely doing it. But if God is causing it, there's no inhibition or preventing your freedom. Actually, your own authentic human causality is caused by God, who is the first cause of all things and all causes. So Aquinas famously says that the two gifts, really, the two most profound gifts that God has given every human, every creature, in fact, are firstly existence, esse, and secondly true and genuine causality, right? So it's not either I'm acting freely or God is acting. It's I'm acting freely because God is acting, which does raise some problems for evil, but I won't talk about that. Although I know you want me to. But it does raise some issues. We can talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. But I need to ask you a question. We love Albert here. And I need to ask you, how do you become the president of the Albertus Magnus Society? Like, that's awesome.
That's a good question. It's not difficult, though. It's not difficult.
It sounds like you are like the number one.
No. In my case, the former president, the outgoing president, asked me to do it, and I said, sure, why not? So it doesn't mean you necessarily know a lot about Albert or whatever, but that you have a great, as I do, a great admiration for Albert and a desire, I suppose, to study his thinking and the wonderful things he shows us about the world and about God and so forth.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have one follow-up question. So, with that, so are you Dominican? Are you Dominican?
Well, I'm personally not Dominican. I'm a married man.
Okay, but
Married is my vocation. Yes.
You could be a lay Dominican.
But I could be. Yes. I haven't done that yet, but I should look into it, huh?
You should. Thank you.
If I can pose a follow-up to Sister Kathy's question on recruitment of you into the associates, what drew you to Albert? So we discussed earlier how Albert was perhaps lesser known throughout the 20th century, and there's more and more scholarship on him. What drew your heart to study Albert and become an Albert scholar?
Oh, this is a great question. I think part of it actually is that for a number of years now, I have been a student of Thomas Aquinas, and probably in order to understand Thomas Aquinas properly and fully, or more fully, one needs to know something, at least, about his great teacher, Albert. And I became, a number of years ago, I co-edited the Brill Companion to Job in the Middle Ages, and became more and more interested from doing that in medieval commentaries on Job, and this also what we call the problem of evil, and how they thought of Job and suffering and evil and God and providence and so forth. So that really drew me into it, just a bit about that.
We have time for two more questions, one from online and perhaps one more in the room. Eddie?
I've got one question from online here. It's from John Leiden. Hello from the CSTM. After listening to your lecture, I'm curious if you could speculate as to how Albert and Aquinas would view and or respond to Rahner's paraphrased view that creation occurred so that it could be saved, or that the fall was part of the divine plan of salvation via the suffering and evil inflicted upon and endured by Jesus.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Thank you for your question. It's a great question. It is a large and difficult question. Certainly, Albert and Aquinas think that Christ came to redeem humanity and, in fact, the whole created order. Right, so we have the ancient tradition of the fall, right, of our first parents as a happy fault, right, because it led to the incarnation, redemption through Christ, so on and so forth. There was a bit of a debate about such things, of course, in the 13th century, turn of the 14th century, between the Dominicans and Franciscans, but we won't talk about that now, no time. That would be the next lecture. And anyway, right, so it's interesting, we talked about this a bit in at the lunchtime discussion, but there does seem to be some tension here, though, right? If you read maybe Aquinas in particular, who seems to think that the universe has a certain perfection, to use his term, right? Even as it is, even as it has quite a few evils in it, right? So of course, for us, evil represents a profound imperfection, right? And the sort of imperfection that Christ came to redeem. Now, this is true also for Albert and Aquinas, but the very fact, for example, that you have, I suggest this in the paper, that you have some creatures that are corruptible and some that are incorruptible represents a certain degree of perfection for Aquinas and Albert. Now, this is not to say that the fall for Aquinas and Albert was entirely or even primarily a good thing, right? But that there was a falling away from the goodness according to which our first parents were created, right? And it had to do with inordinate willing, which resulted in the disorder of a proper order that God had established within each human, between the first humans, and vis-a-vis God. So, but for example, the fact that Aquinas is very clear, the fact that I mentioned this at lunch, I think, the fact that we human beings have essentially animal bodies means that without the special grace that was the gift of original justice, our bodies will be corrupted and we will die. So this is of course the hope of the resurrection, that the resurrected body will be glorified by the glorified soul, right? Which is the soul, of course, is immortal. So, but sometimes students ask, well, is the fall, death, for example, is that natural to the human, or is that a consequence of the fall? And our medieval Dominicans would say, well, both, right? Death was not intended when God created the first humans, and it is natural to the corruptible animal body, right? And yet, if you think of as Albert and Thomas did, if you think of the human as a hylomorphic unity of body and soul, the soul was intended and is intended to perfect the body. So anyway, it's something there of the quite complicated picture. And this often happens. See, this is one of the great things about our medieval Dominicans, and hopefully our modern Dominicans as well, that they always, unlike the new atheists, they always give us a profound and profoundly nuanced view of such complex questions. But I appreciate all of your questions.
Last call for a question in the room.
Thank you for giving me a chance to ask you this question. Do you believe God can be bound to the world of ideas with any precision? And if not, what is it that we are orientating towards in our pursuit of understanding God?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I did. Thank you. That's a great question. I did suggest in the paper, right, that we as theologians, when we talk about God, Aquinas would say, well, we don't know what we're talking about. Okay, right? So for Aquinas and Albert, the name God, Deus in Latin, God in English, is something of a placeholder, right, for the mystery, right, the answer to the question, well, who are we? Why are we here? Why is there anything created rather than nothing, right? So we know through natural knowledge and through divine revelation that God is the creator, and all of those things that Christians profess in the creed, right? Those are good and true and necessary, right? Albert and Thomas would say. And yet, when we say them, we have to profess those realities, realizing that there is much about those realities and others that we simply do not know and cannot say, right? So I suppose Aquinas, for example, would say, well, look, even the person who says, I don't believe in God, when the person uses that name God, he or she intends to signify the first cause of all things, the creator, right? Like even if the person knows nothing about Christianity or redemption or whatever through Christ, that's what the person intends to signify. So there are some things we definitely can, and indeed have to say, but they both say we know. I suggested this too, I think, in the paper. We know what God is not rather than what God is positively, right? So think of any creaturely thing you can think of that you think you know, right? Including ourselves, and God is not. First and foremost, right? They would say, well, God is not that, right? God is not a creature. What it means to be a creature, for our theologians, what it means to be a creature is to be utterly dependent at every moment of one's life on God. Not only for existence, but for conservation in existence, for natural, what we would call natural powers, thinking, doing, acting, so on and so forth. And what it means to be God, we can be fairly certain, is to be utterly independent. So God, maybe it sounds bad and too negative, but God has no need for any creature. God doesn't need a creature to be God. God eternally exists before creation, and God will eternally exist outside time after the end of the world. So anyway, these are some of the things that they say that can help us, I think, speak properly about God. Although you're right. Augustine says this, right? If you've ever read the Confessions of Augustine, we as creatures, right, long to know and praise the Creator. And so we must say some things about God, but after we've done all the theologizing we are capable of, what have we actually said? Right? So as Aquinas knew, especially right at the end of his life, all of our attempts at theologizing, ultimately, this side of beatific vision fall short. We have to know that. So.
Please join me in thanking our guests. our guests, to all who joined us in person and online. Of course, it takes a whole college to put on a program like this. In particular, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Dominican Mission Ministries office, all those present especially, the events office, especially Carolyn, the IT office, especially Eddie and Tim tonight, and all of the college for supporting the Eckhart Center as an expression of the Alberta Magnus College's mission of truth, of practical application of learning, and of educational opportunity. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.